That's how it used to be. Having a failed startup on your resume used to be like a corporate death sentence. Well, that's very different now. Now we're starting to see people develop intentionally the skill of entrepreneurship as a lifelong pursuit that they can use both to found companies, but also to work on innovation in the context of established companies.
Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
I am incredibly excited to have Eric Ries, the best-selling author of The Lean Startup and the founder of LTSE, on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. This week's episode is applying lean startup principles to your career. And it is very special to me to have Eric on the podcast because reading his book, The Lean Startup, really helped spark me to found Venture for Canada and was a really pivotal moment in my life and career. So, Eric, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for saying that. That's very kind.
To get things kicked off, I think the lean startup mindset applies to startups, obviously, in businesses, but it can also really be applied to people's lives and careers. So, in your view, how can early career professionals apply the lean startup mindset of testing hypotheses with minimal resources to their own careers?
So let's start up with what lean startup is. So people, a lot of people have heard the phrase lean startup, but haven't actually read the book or haven't paid attention to the idea behind it. And the idea is actually to develop a management philosophy that works in situations of extreme uncertainty. So whenever we're building a startup, we obviously don't know what's going to happen. And the more radical or bold our vision is, the less we know about what's going to happen in the future. That's on top of the fact that the future is hard to predict anyway. And look around, geopolitical, like read the newspaper. Like who feels like the world is getting more and more predictable every day? Like we're entering a time of tremendous uncertainty. So, uh, a lot of the management practices that we are taught in our careers, especially early in our careers, are really designed for situations of low uncertainty, where we're executing a proven model, we're being told what to do. We have high confidence that what worked in the past will work in the future. And the most important concept in traditional management is the idea of beating the forecast. So if you think about this, this is deeply embedded into almost all the work that people do in mainstream organizations, which is not just, it's not enough to do a good job. That is to do better than you did before or have record numbers. You need to do better than was expected. And in order for that system to make any sense at all, we have to have a way of producing reliable forecasts. How do we do it? We do it by extrapolating from a long and stable operating history. That's why traditional management techniques break down in the face of uncertainty. And that's why we need a new playbook. So, for people who are just starting out in their career, what does this mean? Some of us are going to go into a highly uncertain job on purpose. So we're going to become intentional, on purpose entrepreneurs. And I think for those people, the critical idea that I didn't know when I was starting out in my career, but is very clear to me now, is that really for the first time in history, the past few decades, we have started to see the emergence of entrepreneurship as a career path, distinct from any of the functional responsibilities that we used to see as valid careers. So, it used to be we would have a career in law or engineering or medicine or whatever. Your parents would be very happy. They know that you're going to be financially taken care of because even if you get fired from your current job, your career has equity, it has value. And therefore, if you read stories of entrepreneurship going back, even 100 years, you'll see this stress and pressure of the family being like, oh no, you're stepping off the career track into the uncertainty of entrepreneurship. Who knows if you'll ever work again? And that's how it used to be. Having a failed startup on your resume used to be like a corporate death sentence. Well, that's very different now. Now we're starting to see people develop intentionally the skill of entrepreneurship as a lifelong pursuit that they can use both to found companies, but also to work on innovation in the context of established companies. It's a legitimate career. So that's the intentional entrepreneur. But we also have a lot of people go into their career, become unintentional entrepreneurs. And I think this is really funny because a lot of people, when they're young, especially, get convinced they need a safe job. So, like, you know what? I need to go into a safe career, a career that is stable. It's not going to have a lot of uncertainty to it. So I'm going to pick journalism, or law, or I'm going to go work at this big company that's, immune from disruption. And then next thing you know, like I hope some people listening are laughing when I name those careers. Like, wait a second, if I went to work in journalism, like journalism is being totally exploded right now. So is healthcare, so is education, so are all these huge industries, and of course, many engineering jobs, many so-called stable companies are in the process of falling apart. And I'll never forget, I did a trip early in my time developing Lean Startup. I did a trip to Oulu, Finland, where Nokia is the company town, and there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of engineers, and it was just on the cusp of the smartphone revolution. And people were starting to be like, wait a minute, we all went to work at Nokia because this is the safest, most enduring company. And within a few years, thousands and thousands of those people were laid off. So sometimes we don't have a choice about whether we become entrepreneurs or not. So my advice is either way, to cultivate these particular skills. Don't wait to be laid off. Don't wait for your industry to be disrupted. Be the one seeking the disruption out. We're seeing that with AI now. People are waiting and waiting for, is AI going to disrupt my industry or not? Well, go find out for yourself. Go be the one in your industry, in your company, in your career who's seeking out the uncertainty and learning to manage it. And then you can apply the techniques of Lean Startup, things like minimum viable product. Don't wait to have the perfect solution. View everything that you build as an experiment designed to test a hypothesis. And last thing I'll say, the most important skill to develop in the face of uncertainty is vision. It's not the tactical stuff like split testing or continuous deployment, or I mean, those things are very important, but vision is really the most important thing. Can you imagine the world other than it is now? And then can you think backwards from that future scenario to what would have to be true for that scenario to come true? That's how you find out if it's a vision or a hallucination. But a lot of people go through life never cultivating those visions themselves. So they just get pulled into the gravitational field of whatever the people around them think, and they're basically always doing work that is dominated by conventional thinking. A very important skill is to learn to think for yourself from first principles, like logically speaking. And I'll give you an example. Right now, we've seen the rise of generative AI. A lot of people making all kinds of fancy predictions about AI is going to mean this, AI is going to mean that, without really much understanding of what is the technology of generative AI. How does it work? Well, go take a course. Go learn how it works. It's not that complicated. It's a little bit mysterious, but it's mysterious in ways that kind of nobody, like deep down, why does this work? It's actually kind of stunning that it works at all. So when you do that, what you'll discover is that the current large language model approach to generative AI is basically just language in, language out. It's just tokens in, tokens out. So that already tells us a lot about the kinds of industries that are likely to be immediately disrupted by this technology if it works. It's going to be first the industries where there's no tangible objects that have to get moved around, but just language in, language out. What does that imply? Education, law, product management, analysis, research. Any place where we're moving tokens around, that's going to be the first place for the disruption to hit. So rather than wait for that to happen, why don't you go find out, go find out what it's good for right now? Maybe it will give you superpowers. Maybe you'll be on the cutting edge of something cool, or maybe you'll be the first to find out that the technology does not work. That can be just as valuable to know. Everyone else around you saying this is the future, but you secretly know that for your industry, for your use case, for your thing, it can't work for some reason that you know that other people don't know. Anyway, that is what is that really, to me, cultivating that vision of how things might play out differently is the first step towards embracing entrepreneurship as a career principle.
Our mutual friend, Daniel DeBoe, once said to me about how he thinks one of the biggest mistakes people make in their careers is that they don't understand there's risks in not taking risks, which is core to kind of what you're saying. And yeah, he uses an example that in 2007, Lehman Brothers would have been viewed as like a really like safe career path by most like parents and people. And
Oh
then a
yeah.
year later, out of business, and probably going to go work at Airbnb would have been viewed as like a really risky career path. So to your point, I think sometimes there's a huge risk in not taking risks. So one thing I'd love to zoom in on about is the lean startup and how you've applied it to your own life. For listeners, could you describe an example where you applied the lean startup kind of methodology to like a big question that you were kind of considering in your life?
Well, I mean, the best examples are times when I built whole companies on the basis of that, and so I don't know that they are necessarily the right answer to your question. But yeah, like I have several times in my life been seized with an idea where I was just like, this can't possibly be right. And I'm actually the most skeptical of anybody of my own ideas. So I'm just like, if this was a good idea, surely someone else would have had it. Or surely by now, there must be some good reason why this wouldn't work. And the way I've always pursued it is I just want to understand the idea well enough to know why it won't work so that it will leave me alone. And it's actually very simple. Like people get these startups make it so complicated. Like in the early days, I was just like, look, I don't even know enough to form a hypothesis. Like when I was building LTSE, I was like, I'm going to build a new stock exchange from scratch. Nobody's really done that for equities listing in 50 years. So no one alive really remembers how it's done anyway. It was not even clear to me that it was possible. And lots of people that I met with told me it was impossible, would never work, couldn't happen, etc. And rather than be discouraged by that, I would always ask people, why? Help me understand why from first principles, convince me that this is a bad idea. And what's funny is that the reasons people gave why it was a bad idea were terrible. They were logically inconsistent. They were historically illiterate. They didn't make sense. And I was like, okay, then I must be onto something here. Let's go dig in a little more. Let's try to figure out how it works. And I'll give you one example that was like very, very important. So after talking to, I don't know, probably hundreds of people asking them about this idea, everyone telling me it can't be done, can't be done, can't be done. One day, I met a lawyer, and he said, "Oh, sure, it can be done. No problem. You just got to fill out the form one." I'm like, "The what?" He's like, "Yeah, it's a government form. It's literally called Form One." I'm like, I'm not following what you're saying. I couldn't understand. And he said, look, you know how government forms are all numbered? I'm like, uh-huh. He's like, this is literally SEC form number 0001, the application to establish a national securities exchange. It's a form. It's a complicated form. It's hundreds of pages long. Requires a lot of work to fill it out, but it's not some arcane and mystical process. It's a form. He could have bowled me over with a feather. I was like, it's after all the, and I've been talking to tons of people who are like, just treating it like this very impossible task. I was like, "Oh, if it's a form, now I can work backwards to what would be necessary to fill out the form." And when I did that exercise, what I found out it was gonna be very, very, very difficult. I have to go hire these people that are unhirable. I gotta go raise this money that's unraisable. I gotta go figure out these, I gotta reconcile this and that and figure these regulatory things. Like, it turned this intractable problem into a series of just merely very difficult problems. And, my view of entrepreneurship is it's often like carving the Grand Canyon with water and gravity. You keep at it long enough, you plug away at those problems one at a time in a systematic way. Next thing you know, there you are. So along the way, we did hundreds and hundreds of experiments, all kinds of MVPs, lots of pivots. Like we used the mechanism of Lean Startup to figure out what that path was going to be and find a way to make it work. It was not without its setbacks and difficulties, but if I hadn't had that framework for thinking about the problem and breaking it down in that way, I would have been lost before I even began.
A theme in this interview has been the importance of fostering a mindset of experimentation. And it's clear you definitely have that. What advice do you have for listeners on how to cultivate an experimentation mindset in their own lives?
You have to be ready to be wrong. Like that, most people have built, especially with our school system. We tend to drill people in a real instinctive fear of failure and a feeling like everything can be graded and ranked. And so, if you don't know the answer, there's something wrong with you. But and I remember, I told this story in my second book, The Startup Way, meeting a guy who was like a Six Sigma black belt in a big company, in a manufacturing concern. His job was to keep the trains running on time and make sure everything happened exactly. And he had a mug on his desk that said, "Failure is not an option." Because he was trying to teach his teams to seek for perfection, to double check, to measure twice, cut once. Like he had a different set of problems he was facing than my problems. And I was thinking like, oh man, as an entrepreneur, if I had a mug, what would my mug say? It would have to say, "I eat failure for breakfast." Because in his world, diligent effort can prevent failures. But in entrepreneurship, failures are an inevitable part of the process because we're dealing with uncertainty as our primordial primordial environment. So what you have to do if you want to cultivate an experimental mindset, you have to love the truth more than you're afraid of failure. That's really it. All we're talking about is finding out what the truth is. So I'll give you a simple example. Someone says to you, "I got an idea for a product." "Oh, what is it?" "We're going to invent teleportation." Okay. Now, when people tell me about their product, They always talk about it as if they've invented teleportation, when actually they've, like, helped make database connections, 25% more efficient or something. It's just like, well, that's not quite as good as teleportation. And so, like, we sometimes tease people about, like, stop talking about your product like this is incredible thing when actually customers are only like, "That's okay, I don't mind it, it's alright." But, like, go find out how much customers actually like or dislike your product. Just find out. It doesn't mean, and this is the key, it oftentimes people are afraid to do this. They're like, "Well, what if people say they don't like it? Do I have to give up?" No, not necessarily. In fact, you might learn from that, figure out how to make it better. Or you might say, "You know what? Fire that customer, get me a new one. They're wrong." Okay, there's a lot of ways you can handle the feedback, but the first step is to find out what the truth is. The second reason that's so important is that actually imagine that you had invented teleportation. How would you get your first customer? Like, actually imagine go walking because people think like, "Oh, if I had teleportation, every person I talk to would love it," right? That's some people ask people, "Who's gonna like your product? Who's it for?" They're like, "Every person on earth is gonna love my product." Well, that's a great, easily falsified hypothesis because if every person on earth is gonna love your product, also, logically speaking, the first 10 people I ran into on the street will love your product. So great. Let's go check it out. Here we go. And I've dragged so many entrepreneurs out onto the street, into busy traffic to just talk to someone on the street. If you can't find another way to talk to a customer, I remember sitting with an entrepreneur and we put a Craigslist ad on Craigslist live in the meeting. It's like, why are we debating what customers want? Let's just put the ad on there and see who responds. And we were like getting phone calls from actual customers like minutes later telling us, they liked it, they didn't like it, they had all these opinions, whatever. We got the data like instantly instead of waiting and putting it up. But the last thing is, okay, imagine I actually had teleportation. No one wants to commute. Everyone would rather teleport. But imagine walking down the street and it's like, hi, would you like to be the very first early adopter for a device that will physically dematerialize your body and rematerialize it somewhere else? I'm sure nothing could go wrong. Like, it's actually a pretty hard sell. Like, even if you have the greatest product since sliced bread, even finding someone who would be willing to take a risk on it can be really difficult. So, all we're talking about, it's not about like giving up on the vision. It's not about doing whatever people say. It is fundamentally about trying to discover the truth. What is really in the minds of customers? What are the real obstacles that prevent you from being able to do whatever it is that you want to do? And through that information, we can plot a course to an uncertain future.
I love that advice about embrace and fall in love with the truth rather than what you want the truth to be. I think that's definitely going to stick with me for a long time. Artificial intelligence is, obviously a topic du jour, and I think your principles of the lean startup are as relevant today as ever. But I can imagine some of like the tactics of how you go through that step, or certainly there's new tools kind of like
Oh
available.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, in your view, like how does artificial intelligence, or how is the lean startup and its principles kind of relevant today in an age of AI?
Well, it seems to me like the speed at which we can do many of the tactics that we developed 10, 15, 20 years ago is going to be unparalleled. I mean, the main constraint on our ability to create startups is how quickly we can build the MVP for whatever the thing is. So basically, like when I people talk to me about like, is my industry ripe for disruption, or is it a good fit for for a lean startup? I always ask them to think about two axes, two dimensions. The first question is how much risk is there in the underlying things that are being done in that industry? Like how much do we know already what customers want or don't want? The more risky, the more uncertain, the better it is going to be for lean startup. But the second dimension is simply what is the underlying cycle time? Like how long does it take to bring a new thing to market? The faster that is, the more these techniques will be helpful when we're dealing about manufacturing and physical product construction. Like there's all kinds of industries where there's science, there's regulatory barriers, there's all kinds of stuff that slows it down. Now, just because it's slow doesn't mean you can't use lean startup. What matters is simply can you find a way to have your learning loop cycle be faster than the industry average? So, like I once worked with an appliance company where the average company was bringing a new appliance to market like every 7 years. So I was like, well, if we could do it in 3 years, we would have a huge advantage. So it doesn't always mean going as fast as possible. It just means going faster than the underlying cycle time of the industry has historically been. Well, with AI, it opens up whole new vistas. So, for example, I was talking to Craig Newmark, who created Craigslist the other day. And he was saying that people have forgotten this now because everyone's like Craigslist's the most obvious idea in the world. Of course, it's like a fixture of our lives. We can't even imagine a world where there wasn't any Craigslist. I guess I was just telling that story about Craigslist. That's why it's on my mind. And it took him several years to figure out what the company was gonna be. It actually was quite difficult to figure out what it was, and he went through all these different things. It was an email thing for a while, it was a volunteer-based thing for a while, it was a nonprofit for a while, like, it went through a lot of these iterations, and it took a lot of iterating to do it. But the reason it survived that long, long, long flat part of the hockey stick was that he didn't have to raise any money because it was just him. It was a simple design. He was just writing the code himself. He could just iterate it as a one-man band until he figured it out, and then it took off and it became this thing. So, um, the kinds of companies that most can benefit from this approach are ones where there's a relatively small team, ideally like one or only a couple people who can build entire products end to end fast enough that they can incorporate the learning they're getting before they forget what it is. And what AI is going to do is bring thousands or even millions of people into entrepreneurship who couldn't have done it before. We're going to start to see one person, two person, three-person companies like outcompete 100-person companies. And we're going to be able to see after we learn how to build software correctly with AI, which I don't think the current vibe coding is going to get it done. We got some real work that has to get done. But as we learn to apply software engineering techniques with these models, we're going to start to see more and more companies. It'll start in software, but then it will spread to other industries where a very small number of people can build very elaborate MVPs very quickly. And that's going to open up a huge explosion of entrepreneurial opportunities.
Yeah, it's never been, I think, a more exciting time to be an entrepreneur or want to be like an entrepreneur. Even I think I'm 33, and when I compare how the situation's changed to when I was 23, it's like it's such an exciting kind of time. I think, especially for people who maybe aren't super technical, to go launch new things. You touched on it, but if you were to like rewrite the Lean Startup, which came out, I think around it was what 2011,
2011, yeah. Mhm.
yeah. So it came out 14 years ago. If you were to rewrite like the Lean Startup today, how would you change it, like if at all?
You know, I've thought about that a lot because, of course, I've debated whether I should do a new edition, but I don't think I would be possible to do it. There's something naive about the lean startup is what part of what makes it work is it's not yet weighted down with all the things that have happened in the last 15 years. It's very much a product of its time. Now, I think we're trying to articulate these, timeless principles that are enduring, but we need the simple examples that we use then are the ones that illustrate it best. And I remember, I'll never forget this. Someone, when I was having test readers read the book before it was published, someone came to me and said, why don't you have more stories of failed startups in here? Seems like you should have more failure stories." And I was like, "Oh, don't worry. We have lots of failed startups in here. We just don't know which ones yet." So, like, many of the startups that we profiled in Lean Startup are now dead, long gone. Remembered only because they were briefly mentioned in the Lean Startup. That's their claim to fame, but that's okay. We were trying to illustrate these principles. Now we have thousands and thousands and thousands of case studies to choose from, much more successful companies than the ones there. We could do a way better job in a lot of ways, but I think we would lose the simplicity of the message of that book. And there's some parts, of course, I cringe at now where I'm like, oh man, there's like one of the chapters in the book is how to scale up lean startup, beyond the startup phase. And I very breezily said, "Oh, you should just do this, this, and this." I made it sound real easy. I've subsequently written multiple books about about that topic. Like going into much greater detail. I know a lot more about it now. So there's things I would think about fixing, but I think having watched other authors go back and do this, I think it's impossible. You can't help but have your experience kind of ruin the clarity of the initial insight. So I've decided not to touch it for now.
And I think that's a really perceptive comment. Like, I think so many of the ideas that the most resonance, it's kind of like Occam's razor. Like, it is, there's a beauty to the sort of the simplicity, but also the, I think, insightfulness of the idea. And by the way, on the topic of like cringe of reading something you've read in the past, I saw in Toronto around a year ago, Ira Glass speak, and he was talking about so much of being an artist or a creator or coming with new ideas is that process of sometimes cringing at like past things. So I share that just I think for anyone that's a listener who, if you're a creator, it's I think it it's a it is it's interesting to sort of you know cringe, but also recognize that's part of the sort of learning journey of life.
If
And
if you're learning and growing, I think if you're not embarrassed about your work you were doing a year ago, then you're not growing fast enough. So yeah, it is painful to look back 14 years, but in some ways, it helps me see how far we've come. Now, I will say one other thing that is tricky is that I have a lot more scars from advocating these ideas. So the other thing is like you're hearing the voice of a person who has not yet really faced significant pushback. The misinformation environment that we live in now is very different than 14 years ago, and there's so much BS, and there's so many people who have figured out how to distort, lie about, attack, polarize things for their own benefit. So there's a huge amount of trauma, that is also not present yet. Is all the things we figured out. So like, yes, I think if we rewrote the book now, as a movement, we would be busy trying to refute all these attacks and explain all these misunderstandings. We'd be spending so much time refuting the wrong ideas that in some ways we'd be obscuring the clarity of the original message. So I try to keep that in mind myself now, and not become one of those bitter, crusty, old, cynical people that's like, you haven't if you'd only seen what I've seen, then I tried to resist that. But I think it would be very difficult to write about it with the same kind of purity of intention, having been through all that was possible then.
To loop back to something you said at the beginning of your interview, you talked about how this is very much a time of tremendous uncertainty, whether it's in politics or artificial intelligence, climate change. List goes on. There's a lot of
Yeah,
uncertainty out there in the world, and one's 20s is a tremendous period of uncertainty because school system, you kind of go grade 3, grade 4, kind of etc., and then you're like you graduate from college, you go to college, and then you're like, oh wait, now I have this whole life in front of me, and there's and also the world is super uncertain. So what advice do you have for people who are, let's say, just starting their careers on how to navigate the tremendous personal and kind of world uncertainty out there?
I have a lot of humility about this because I don't know. I turned 20 in a very stable world. We thought it was uncertain. We used to joke about how chaotic it was. But by when I look back now, I'm like, wow, I grew up in the latter part of what they call the long 20th century, a time of tremendous stability, geopolitical order, and liberal democracy so ascendant that people were talking about the end of history. So I actually can't really imagine what it's like to grow up with those institutional protections stripped away. And I think if you look at the generational divides on many issues, just it's very clear to me that we've raised a generation of people who just do not have faith or trust in institutions for good reason. They've seen the institutions that govern civic life be proved weak and inadequate in so many ways over the course of their young life. So you have to find a way to turn that into a strength. Some people find that paralyzing and depressing, and I hear you. But there's also an opportunity in that, which is that like a lot of people in my generation got trapped into seeking prestige in the context of institutions and built their lives and their careers around climbing up the ladder of some institution that fundamentally did not reward their loyalty in kind. Um, if you can skip the process of being disillusioned by that because you never had any illusions about it in the first place, I think you have a huge advantage. So the first thing is just to find places where your work is in line with your values. And that's something that's so easy to say, but so hard to do. And a technique I found extremely helpful in my own life and in other lives is like to really make sure that you're never in a situation where you're making money through exploitation. You're never making money through the contravention of your own values. And I'm not trying to tell you what you should value, whatever it is, insist that that is what the company you work for does. Now, there's two things to worry about. What if you're not sure? Sometimes you're in a company, you're like, I don't actually know what this company does, or I think it sounds like they're saying all the right things, but I'm not sure. Well, go get sure. Like, find out, do your due diligence, treat it like an investor, and go really try to find out what's going on. And if you're not sure, or the second case is, what if you just need the money? You're like, look, I need to eat. This is not advice for people who are struggling. Okay, so if you're struggling to feed your family, take whatever job, it's fine. What the concept I think is really important is what I call the maximum ethical salary. There's really good research, and it's controversial, so people disagree on what the threshold is. But there's some threshold after which, if you make more money than that, you start to see diminishing returns in terms of happiness. And so there's this like U-shaped curve where, like, if you're too poor, obviously life is a struggle. You get comfortable, you start to feel good, you have like financial security for you and your family, you start to feel better, and then you start to get too wealthy and you start to be concerned with too much with material things, and it kind of ruins your life. So people who say like, "Oh, I can't be virtuous. I can't afford to be picky at my job." It's like, "Well, do you make more than $70,000 a year?" If you make $55,000 a year, definitely. This is not advice for you. Just do what you need to do. Don't worry about it. But as you start to become a professional, you start to think about making more money than that. Now you're making $100,000 a year, $200,000 a year, $300,000 a year. I would say it is actually unethical to make that extra money if you don't know whether the work you do is in fact making the world a better place according to your own values or not. So if you're genuinely not sure and you can't get sure, it's an easy solution. Just if you get paid that much, only work 1 day a week. Just cap your salary at what you're comfortable with and use the extra time either to find out now you have all the time you need to find out whether the work you do in fact is of value, or better yet, go start a company or join a company that actually genuinely lives in line with your values. And whatever you in theory might sacrifice in terms of earnings, you will more than make up for in having the experience of doing your work in alignment with the things you most deeply believe. Now, my experience having counseled a lot of people through this over the many years, you'll probably also make a lot more money since non-exploitative value creating businesses tend to be actually more profitable over the long run. And it's the exploitative ones. It's funny we've mentioned Enron and Lehman Brothers, and like it's not a coincidence that these companies were also built on exploitative and fraudulent business models. So by sticking to this rule, I bet you make more money in the long run. But either way, you'll be a lot happier.
To take a step back from that even kind of further, I think a lot of young people, in my experiences, they have maybe intuition about what their values are, but they don't necessarily have specifically like articulated ones in their head. So, what advice do you have for someone starting their career on how to go through the process of actually articulating those values to themselves?
Okay, so the hardest part of this is you have to learn to think for yourself. And that's not an insult, but most people actually go through life like stochastic parrots. It's like, to me, the number one most revolutionary finding of AI has nothing to do with AI, but what it's shown us about human intelligence. Because people criticize AIs, they're like, these are just run on sentence machines. They don't understand what they're saying. They're just blabbing on a bunch of language. And yet they seem quite intelligent. And I think what we're discovering is that what we call intelligence is not actually involved thinking necessarily. It's possible to just run your mind on autopilot, just producing whatever the sentences, just producing the tokens necessary to get by. And I feel like I meet more and more people where I look at them, I'm like, oh yeah, stochastic parrot does not just parroting things that they've already heard before. Just they are not actually thinking about what they're saying, and therefore are very easy to manipulate and mislead. So first thing you have to have a commitment to think for yourself and actually try to figure out what your values are. And just taking that step of trying to find it out, whatever practices you need in order to do that. Like seek out mentors and some people see this through a spiritual lens, like go for it. Don't feel bad about this. Like actually discovering who you are and what you're all about is super super valuable. The second piece of advice is don't just sit there and like go on social media and be like, I wonder what I value. Like that's not the path to thinking. Um, to do actual original thinking, to do true learning, you have to get away from what other people think. So first off, it's like detox, get off TikTok, get off social media, like detox from all that stuff. That stuff is like it's going to be the our kids and grandkids are going to think of it the same way we think of like tobacco and secondhand smoke. Just like it's just an illness that we were addicted to this thing. It's a soporific. So use it when you need to detox, like when you need to de-stress, you want to get away from thinking, okay, it's fine. But if your goal is to actually do some introspection, you got to get away from those things. And the second thing is you don't have to sit there in a cave and have great enlightenment and then figure out your values. You discover your values when things that you do turn out the way you didn't expect. So that's actually why I think entrepreneurship is such a great moment, a great process of self-discovery. And so taking an entrepreneurial mindset, doing any kind of scientific method is often about self-discovery. Okay, and I'll give you just a very simple example. Two different people, when faced with the same dilemma, could resolve it differently and yet legitimately. So, like, I'll give you an example. I was coaching a team once, and they wanted to. Let's see if I can get this right. They were trying to do like mental health software that was supposed to help teens have better mental health. And they were going to sell it to school districts. So when you conceive an idea like that, everything's easy. The teens love it, the school districts love it, their parents love it, everyone's willing to pay for it, it works, everything's great. But when you actually do it in real life, what you'll often discover is like, and I can't remember in this case, I think it was like the teens loved it, but the parents didn't like it, or the school districts wouldn't pay for it, or like something worked and something didn't work. So now we need to pivot. What is a pivot? Pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. So we have to find a new way to get to the vision. But now we've discovered something. Uh oh. two elements of the vision are in conflict with each other. We wanted to reform the school system and we wanted to help a bunch of teenagers. Which one is it? If you had to choose one, which one would you choose? Somebody might say, no, 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 my goal was to reform the school system. So we need to pivot the offering to make it more attractive to schools. But another person would legitimately say, who cares about schools? I'm trying to help teenagers not commit suicide. So we need to focus on making this thing affordable for teenagers to be able to buy it directly. You see how different those two companies are? But those are the same vision confronted with the same data. Why are two different people making two different choices? That's how we learn what our values are. So it's only when reality forces us to give up something. It's painful. It can lead to a lot of suffering. But we need to put ourselves in a position, got to put ourselves out there to try things in order to suffer, in order to discover what we really care about. And that's, I think, a much better way to find out what you value than like doing some kind of journaling exercise or something.
Yeah, it's in moments of challenge, both personally, but also I think as like a society where you really see like what do you care about,
Yeah.
and like what are your core values. Eric, I think that's a perfect note to end things off in the interview. Thanks so much for being a guest on A New Wave of Entrepreneurship.
Oh, thanks very much. I thought you were going to say, and that's why we're seeing, like, because a character is revealed in a crisis, and we're all learning a lot about Canada's character right now. So stay strong. It's been very inspiring to watch them across the border. I'm sorry that these are the circumstances under which it's happening, but it's actually been really incredible to watch.
Well, yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it has been. It definitely, I think this is the most trying moment in Canadian history since the Second World War, and I think I know Canadians really appreciate when folks south of the border are allies and say kind words. Sometimes Canadian news can go a little bit under the surface in the U.S. Saying that as a Canadian who's lived in the U.S. for 5 years, well, I live in Canada now, but in the past. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I really appreciate you saying that, and yeah, I've also been heartened, I think, by the solidarity of Canadians kind of coming together to unite and appreciate the kind words.
Well, I hope it leads to something good in the end. We can all pray for that.
Yeah, hopefully. Thanks
Awesome.
so
Well,
much,
thanks for
Eric.
having me on. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.